The UK renegotiation of EU membership was a package of changes to European Union rules proposed by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom David Cameron, and agreed by EU leaders on the 19th of February 2016. These changes were intended to take effect following a vote for Remain in the UK's EU referendum on the 23rd of June, at which point suitable legislation would be presented by the European Commission. The deal was discarded soon after the UK voted to leave the European Union. The renegotiated terms were in addition to the United Kingdom's existing opt-outs in the European Union and the UK rebate. The changes were legally binding insomuch as the intentions and statements made by the EU leaders were enshrined in an international treaty. The implementation of some of the changes would have required legislation, a treaty change within the EU, and so the details may have altered. Although it would be hard for the European Commission of the European Parliament to directly define national governments. The red card allows a member of the Council of the European Union with the support of 15 other members to return a law to the European Parliament for further changes. This is not a veto, as EU lawmakers could still go ahead if they judge that they have addressed the concerns raised by the red card, which is named after the penalty card used in football. Cameron backed the red card as a means to support the EU's principle of subsidiarity, which he believes is not fully realized. In this way, the red card is intended for groups of EU leaders to block or reform EU laws where they think it is the job, rather than that of the EU, to make laws on a particular subject. The red card will join the existing yellow card and the orange card. The use of the red card will require backing of 55% of governments at the Council, which is slightly less than is required to approve laws, which is 55% of all countries and votes representing 65% of the EU's population. Deporting EU immigrants. Free movement of people is an important tenet of the European Union and enshrined in primary law in treaties. The EU deal subtly changes the free movement rules to make it easier for countries to deport EU immigrants. This is achieved by beefing up the exceptions to the general rule that EU citizens can live and work where they choose in the EU. National governments have a carefully restricted ability to restrict the free movement of people about the EU. Once a citizen lives in another EU country, the threshold of reason for the local government to remove them becomes progressively higher. The changes planned in the EU deal are subtle changes of wording to permit governments to take into account where migrants' behavior is likely to represent a threat, rather than that it does, and allows government to take into more account a person's past behavior rather than just the present, until they are implemented and tested in European law through the EU's European Court of Justice and, possibly, in the European Court of Human Rights. It will be hard to quantify the impact of these changes. The consensus from the EU leadership is that they will give nations more power to deport criminals and prevent the return, but not necessarily restrict movement for other reasons. Child benefit. The deal makes no changes to the principle that child benefit should be paid to citizens no matter where their children reside. However, following the deal, governments will be able to adjust the payment they make to reflect the standard of living in the country the child lives, and the amount of child benefit that would normally be paid in that country. Although many people have questioned the idea of paying child benefit for children living in other countries, it is a logical consequence of the EU's principle of non-discrimination, as migrants are more likely to have children in another country and would, therefore, be discriminated against by restricting those benefits. Once the changes to law were passed to reflect this agreed change, it would be up to the Court of Justice to clarify if it is legal or there are any unintended consequences if it was subsequently challenged. ever closer union. In the EU deal there is a statement specifically exempting the UK from ever closer union. The precise phrasing of the aspiration, which was in the preamble of the EU's founding treaty and every treaty since, is ever closer union of the peoples. The phrase has symbolic political status, but it has little or no legal effect in any of the treaties, and thus UK's exemption from it is equally symbolic. The deal is explicit in saying that the presence of the ever closer union phrase in the treaties does not of itself grant the EU any specific competencies or powers. The UK and the Eurozone. The EU deal attempts to reassure non-Eurozone countries, including the UK, that decisions will not be made favouring Eurozone members over them. There will now be a system for non-Eurozone members to object to laws being passed that might harm them, but it will not give them a legal opt-out. However, EU law already bans discrimination, so this is merely an additional protection. Along with Denmark, the UK has an opt-out to the 1992 Maastricht Treaty, which means they are not obliged to join the euro. Prior to this EU deal, there was concern that Eurozone members may discuss matters of the EU and single market separate to the wider membership and, therefore, come up with a deal they could impose on non-Eurozone countries. In the Council, Eurozone members would have sufficient majority to pass laws if they wished, although those laws would need to be proposed and drafted by the Commission first and also approved by the European Parliament. In addition to specifically banning such discrimination, it also contains a statement of intent that any measures for economic and monetary union will be voluntary for non-Eurozone countries, and that those countries will not stand in the way of such measures for those in the Eurozone. For example, non-Eurozone countries will not be required to contribute to bailouts for Eurozone countries, limiting residence rights for family members. The European Parliament intends to bring forward legislation to change EU law to limit the ability of a non-EU national to gain the right to live and work anywhere in the EU by becoming the spouse of an EU citizen. There has been some back and forth on the matter in the European Court of Justice, with existing laws being inconclusive. This change to the law, if approved, should clarify the matter. The changes to the law could still be challenged in both the EU Court of Justice and the Court of Human Rights. This change in law is not intended to deal with deliberate abuses of the immigration policy for which existing tools exist, legal status and enforcement. The EU deal is international law as it was made by European heads of government acting outside of the structure of the EU. The UK intended to register it as such. This means that statements and intentions made within it cannot be challenged by the Court of Justice. However, certain aspects of it will need treaty change within the EU. Certain elements will need legislation to become part of EU law. The Commission has already indicated its intention to bring the legislative requirements to the EU Council and Parliament for passage. Outcome. On the 27th of June 2016, David Cameron said in his statement to the House of Commons on the result of the referendum, "The deal we negotiated at the European Council in February will now be discarded and a new negotiation to leave the EU will begin under a new Prime Minister."